Alrighty there, fellow mini painters and lovers of all things Oldhammer related, and welcome to another video from Nostalgiahammer Hobbies. In this one, we're going to be painting something that is pretty special and near and dear to my heart, the good old Hive Tyrant. In this video, I'm going to be attempting to do a bit of a weapon swap conversion by taking the bone sword off of its original arm and putting it onto the lash whip arm. And then I'm going to be attempting to imitate the original Tyranid Codex colour scheme by giving it a proper Hive Tyrant paint job. So, grab yourself a cuppa, because this is going to be a bit of a long one, and let's go to the painting desk and get started. This Tyrant's being done from Rich from Bring About Wargaming, and he's asked for something a little bit different with it. Instead of its typical loadout of a lash whip and bone sword, he's asked that it have dual bone swords instead. So to do this, we're going to have to do a little bit of converting and weapon swap work on some metal miniatures. To do this, what I'm going to be using is a wire saw. We're going to be wanting a Dremel with a metal cutting disc on it. We're going to be wanting some decent needle files, some super glue, and some super glue activator. We're also going to want 2 bone sword arms, as well as a lash whip arm. So now with all the tools gathered together, let's get to the desk and get cracking with it. We're going to start with the wire saw to cut the bone sword off. Now, something you want to be careful of, which I notice when doing something like this, is you want to be careful where you're holding the part you're trying to cut off. So I noticed the bone sword starting to bend and it started to get a bit of a stress fracture on here, so I swapped over to holding it by the arm, which is a lot easier and a lot safer for the actual part. You can turn it round and just work the wire saw around the inside of the hand guard as you go, until it eventually just pops off. And once it pops off, you're going to want to get your needle files. And if you've got a good set, you should have some with some different shapes in it, and I'm starting out with one that's got a slightly curved edge to it, or inner side to it, to help file down the shape on the inside part there. And just keep going backwards and forwards, and a good trick to do is to line it up to the part you're going to be putting it on. So as you can see at the top there, I've got the lash whip arm handy there, so I can do a comparison with it as you're going. And just keep going slowly, and be careful not to bend it. I did notice as well during this that the actual hilt part, the knuckle guard, was very flexible as well, so if I wasn't careful on that, that could break quite easily. So that is something you want to be mindful of when holding these metal parts, is not to let them bend too much, because they will snap under the stress. And it's not the same as plastic, which you can just put together with plastic glue. Like, metal snaps and it's going to be all sorts of bad days, which you can see here. And if you keep at it nice and slowly and working away nice and steadily, you can see there that we've got it in approximately the right sort of shape, and we can get a good idea of where to cut the lash whip handles to fit the bone sword on. Much to my annoyance, I didn't successfully record cutting some of these bits up. So, I've got the bone sword detached. That was done quite nicely. Now, one thing I will say, when you're cutting this off, it can be very delicate. So that little bit there, if you're not careful, will snap very nicely. We got it cut off, and then when I finally cut it off, got some needle files. Now I used a round one, a nice round needle file, to file that down to the shape. And then, to cut the handle parts off the lash whip, I used a Dremel with a metal cutting disc on it. Now, what I will say is, if you are going to do this, be certain to wear eye protection when you're doing it, because I could feel little spits of metal coming up and hitting me in the face. I was wearing my eye protection when I was doing this. You definitely want to do that, otherwise you're going to risk damaging your eyes. And once I got them cut off, I used a different shaped needle file. I used a flat one to file down the handle parts, where his hand is. Now that he's all cut off and ready, boop, boop, there we go. So now we are on to gluing it into place. So we're going to get our super glue. And we are going to get some super glue activator. Any super glue activator will do. This is the one I use. sure you got it lined up nicely. Like that. There you go. And there will be a bit of filling in to do afterwards, but that's alright, we can live with that. So you can see that. Get it nicely lined up. I'm not going to need to pin this or anything, I don't think. So, get some super glue. Get the lid off. I'm going to put a little blob on the top. Dunk, like that. Now if you put too much super glue on like you've done there, you can use a little bit of tissue paper or something, which I don't happen to have, so I'm going to use my finger. Boop. You shouldn't do that. I'm going to put another little bit of super glue on there. Try not to do so much this time. There we go. Now, do that, line them up, which I think that looks pretty good. There we go. Let's examine that from all angles. Then, take your super glue. Now, I've done this before, I'll say it again. Instead of spraying super glue activator, it's a good idea. You can loosen the top off, do this carefully. When you take it out, like that. Just basically touch it to where you want it. Yeah, I'm happy with that. You don't need much. There we go. Now I would advise screwing the lid straight back on, because it's easy to knock off. There you go. Done. And there we have a weapon swap. And the reason we've done that is because on here it has the big chunky shoulder pad, which that arm does not have. So, boop, there we go. Now we're still going to have to fill this in and do some gap filling around there to tidy it up, but it probably won't be much. So, we will come back when we are going to be doing that. To finish off the bone sword, what we're going to do is take a little bit of green stuff and just fill in any little gaps that are left around the hilt of the lash whip connecting onto the bone sword itself. There isn't really very much on here, to be honest, and you really do not need a lot of green stuff at all. So I've just got a craft knife there to cut off tiny bits and poke it into the holes, and then some modelling tools to smooth anything out and add in any little wrinkly bits or details. But there really isn't actually very much, so you should be alright when putting this on if you attempt this one. And then with the little gaps filled in, that is the conversion all finished up. So now we can get to painting. Before we get to painting this miniature, I just wanted to say that the same as in when I did the Aquila on the Predator tank, hopefully in that video there, doing this weapon swap and conversion with these metal parts wasn't nearly as difficult and as daunting as I thought it was going to be. So, if any of you are thinking of giving this a whirl, and have been put off a little bit, maybe thinking it's a bit out of your range or something like that, or it's going to be a bit difficult with the metal miniatures, don't be. Again, it's not as difficult as I feared it was going to be, and you may well find the same. Now then, for this paint job, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to do my very best to imitate this out of the original 2nd edition Tyranid Codex. Now, it's going to involve a lot of paints, so I'm going to do my best to get through it as quick as I can, especially the base colours. But then after that, we're going to get some really quite interesting parts where we're going to be doing some wet blending and bits like that. So, let's get to the painting desk and let's have some fun. To prime the Tyrant, I've used some Tamiya Fine Surface Primer, light grey. This stuff isn't cheap at all by any stretch, and it's quite a small can, but it does go a very long way, and it also gives an extremely fine surface to paint it on. So it's very, very good. But again, it's not the cheapest, so up to you whether or not you go for this one, but I would advise using a white primer or a very light grey primer for this, because we want the colours to be nice and bright. I'm going to start by doing the bone areas. There are two types of bone on this model. There is a yellower bone on things like the bone sword and some of the ridges, and then there's a whiter bone on the leg armour and on his hooves. I'm going to start with the yellower bone on the bone swords and certain ridges. For that, I'm going to start with a base coat of Zandri dust all over it. Now, if you can get hold of the Codex, or if you've got one, have a very good look at the picture as you go through it. And you can see from this picture here what areas you're aiming for. So it'd be like the bone swords, there's claws and talons, and some ridges on his head, teeth, things like that. And we'll try and whiz through these base coats as quick as we can. So as soon as we've done that, we shall be right back and move on to the next one. And with that, that's the Zandri dust finished. And that's the bone swords done, the shoulder plates done, some talons and other bits and bobs like that. For the next one we're going to be doing is the joints in his arms. So there's the funny little bits in his hands and some of the cabling that comes from the gun as well. And for that one, we are going to be using Stegodon Stale Green to begin with on that one. I'm just going to work that one through nicely onto all the little gaps like that, and we should be back with that one finished. And with the Stegodon Scale Green finished, there we go. Now, what I've also done is the green on the seed pod, which I've used Cabalite green on to go in between there. Now, it will be tidied up with some pink over the shells, or whatever you want to call them, the scales. So from here, we're going to move on, we're going to do some of the purples. And there's 3 different types of purples. I'm going to do the seed pod first of all, and that one I'm going to be using some Xerius purple to start off with a base coat on that. And that's just in between the little ribby bone parts on there. See, and we should be back when that's done. And that's the Xerius purple finished on the seed pod. And we also did it on the armour panelling on its body, around its groin area, and on the spines on its tail. Went round. The final purple we're going to base coat is the bigger front shoulder armour panels there. And we're going to do that in Naggaroth Night. And we'll be back when that's done for the next part. With that, that's the Naggaroth Night part finished off. The next part we're going to be doing is the top armour carapace with those 6 spines on there. If you look at the artwork, you'll see that it's a much darker blue, almost black. So I'm going to be mixing Abaddon Black and Cantor Blue together into a 2-part black, 1-part Cantor mix. So that'll give a nice, very, very dark blue to go all over that. And now with that really dark blue finished all over the scales, as well as on the knuckle guards and the veins on the bone swords, we are ready to move on to the next one, which is going to be Evil Sun's Scarlet, which, if you look at the photo in the Codex, you'll see that it's pretty much most of the flesh now. It's got some horns and that lot and some bone to miss out. We're doing that all over the arms, the legs, tail, but not the head and not the hands. And we'll be back when that's finished. And with that, the Evil Sun's Scarlet has been laid down. The next couple of base coats we're going to do, we're going to pop through in together. I'm going to be doing the pink shells or crustacean parts on this part on the weapon, which I'm going to be using Pink Horror. I'm just going to go over and pick all of those out and highlight them up later. And then I'm also going to do the second type of bone over the hooves and parts like that, which I'm going to be using Rakarth Flesh for as a base coat. And once we've done both of those, we shall be back with the next part. With that, that is the Pink Horror finished on the scaly parts, and the Rakarth Flesh finished on the hooves and other bony parts. Now don't worry, we are getting to the end of these base coats. I know I did say that there's going to be quite a few and that this is going to be a long video, but we are almost there. And what we've got left to do is the head, flesh, some veins, and then the gun. But we're going to be doing some wet blending on the gun. So with the flesh on the head, I'm going to be starting out with a base coat of Warp Fiend Grey all over that. And to do the veins coming off or the back of his head and all round it, I'm going to be using a base coat of Screamer Pink. And when we've got these ones down, we can get onto the final base coating, which is going to be on the wet blending for the gun. Now that we've got the Tyrant's face base coated up, we are almost there with the base coats. We just have the main body of the Barbed Strangler to do now. For that, what we're going to be using are some contrast paints. I'm going to be using some Volupus Pink, some Ultramarines Blue, and some Pterodon Turquoise for this. So let's get back to it when we're putting those down, and I'll show you how to do a nice simple bit of wet blending. When it comes to the main part of the Barbed Strangler, I'm going to start with Volupus Pink and do it all over the bottom part of it like that. If you look at the picture of the Barbed Strangler, you'll see that on the end barrel part, it's got a lovely blend between the pink and a very deep blue. And the way I'm going to do that is with contrast paints, which if you ask me, one of the things they are perfectly suited for is wet blending. So I'm going to start with the Volupus Pink at the end like this and just work it back part of the way, and then change over to the Ultramarines Blue, because you want to lay down lighter colours first and then put the darker colours over it, because otherwise the lighter colours struggle to go over the black. And you're going to do the Ultramarines Blue going up to meet the Volupus Pink, and then get a little bit more Volupus Pink on your brush and start working it backwards and forwards over the join part, and just work around the barrel like that, picking it out. And like I said, go just down to about there with the Volupus Pink, and then from the other bit work up towards that with the Ultramarines Blue, and just keep going backwards and forwards with it. Now that we've got the wet blending on the barrel part done, it's time we can move on to the hose part underneath here. What I'm going to do for that is I'm going to start out with some Pterodon turquoise and work that down about halfway, and then go in with the Ultramarines Blue again and going from the other end and working it towards the Pterodon turquoise, and then when you get in the middle of it, start mixing them together again. And if you need to get some more Pterodon turquoise on your brush to do that, do so. And you just keep working backwards and forwards like that until you've got a lovely wet blend on there, and keep working around. It's relatively simple to keep going, just keep patient with it and don't worry. And then finally, with that last little bit of wet blending done, that is all the base colours laid down on this beauty. From here, we're going to be moving on and we're going to be doing the highlights and tidying up, and that is what is really going to make this model pop. Let's go freshen your cup of tea and see where we're going. Now we're almost there with the base coating stage, and it's just the washes left to do. What we're going to start with for the washes, we're going to do an Agrax Earthshade wash over both of the bony areas. So that's the Xandri Dust Bone over the bone swords and shoulder pads, as well as the Rakarth Flesh that's over the hooves and the shin armour. To finish off the Rakarth Flesh bone areas, after the Agrax Earthshade, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some Nuln oil, and I'm going to work that up into the actual recesses of it. And you're going to want to do this over a few layers, building it up. You can use a hairdryer to dry it out in between each layer. And as you build it up, you'll get that much darker bit acquiring up into the building up in the much deeper recesses of it, which is what we want before we go for the highlighting. Now I move on to the purple areas, which we are going to use Druchii Violet on. So that'll be all the purple armour, as well as the head and hands, and the darker purple shoulder plates. And then to finish off those top shoulder plates there, we're going to take some Nuln oil and put it kind of going towards the middle of the plates there to make it a bit darker in the centre of them. Next up for the washes is Quelia Green Shade, which we are going to put over both of the green areas. So that's all the areas on the hands, anything between their arms, and little things on the back of the legs there, as well as any tubes that are on the gun, as well as the little green parts in between the pink scales on that under organism on his gun as well. Now for all the red, such as his tongue and all of his remaining body. For that, we are going to be using some contrast paint again with Blood Angels Red. And you want to put this on reasonably liberally. Don't go mad with it, but you're going to want to make sure it definitely collects up in any details that are on here. And then from there, we just have one more stage to go. And with that Blood Angels Red applied all over there, we can see that there has added some quite nice darker shading into the recesses and texture all over this red armour. From here, we're now going to do the final bit, which is this very, very dark blue arm panelling on the very top. And for that, we are going to use another contrast paint, Leviathan Blue. And you're going to want to put this over in a couple of glazes, really, not so thickly that it pulls in the recesses, but just enough so that it tints it an even more bluer surface over there. And then with that, that is all the washes and everything finished, and we're ready to move on. With the base colours and the washes down on this miniature, we're a good 2/3 of the way through the painting process and almost finished. But your cup of tea is probably either finished or gone cold. So whilst we're going to refill, I do hope you'll forgive my filthy capitalist heart whilst I run a quick message from the sponsor of this video, myself and my commission painting studio. Do you have boxes gathering dust? Is your pile of inspiration turning into a pile of shame? If so, send them to me at Cauldron of Paint, where I offer multi-tier painting levels, with bronze for an army anyone would be proud to use, silver for that high tabletop finish, and golden display levels for those major characters and mind-blowing displays. If this interests you, go to the link in the description below to my website, where you'll be able to see galleries of some of my previous work, as well as get a quote if you'd like. Now that that's finished with, and we're all topped up with a new fresh cup of tea, we can get back to the video, where we're going to be doing the highlights and the finishing touches to the Hive Tyrant. So let's get back to the desk, grab your brushes, and let's have some fun. Just before we start the final highlighting stage, I just want to point out that for doing the black wash on his tongue here, it took about 5 coats to build it up to this nice level. And it's got quite a nice solid gradient going to it, ready for highlighting. Now then, for the yellower bone, we're going to start by reapplying a coat of Xandri dust. Now thin this down to a roughly slightly thinner than 2 thin coats, and build it up. And as you're building this up, just do it in sort of ticking motions to give the impression of texture. And once we have done the Xandri dust reapplied over the bone and the sword, we are going to go in with some Ushapti bone, which we are going to use to cover up nearly all of the Xandri dust that we've just done, but not quite all of it. And again, try and apply it in little lines, building them up to give the impression of texture. And when we're doing the bone sword, what we're going to do is pretty much the same way, but instead of starting from the very bottom of it, we're going to start from around about here and just build it up in line motions as you're going. And then add a nice edge highlight to it in your Ushapti bone, because that will make it stand out a little bit more. And then to finish it off, we're going to go up to Screaming Skull, and we're going to cover not a lot of this one, and again apply it in little lines, building it up over the bony areas. And then when it comes to the sword, we're just going to do it from this point here, building up in lines to the tip, and then apply a bit of an edge highlight. And to finally finish off the shoulder pads in particular, if you look at the picture, you'll see they've got a black part painted to give it a distinction between the shoulder and the arm. To do that, we're just going to take some Abaddon black and just carefully paint it in and fill that gap in. And then we are going to move on to the next bone. With the first bone set finished off, we can now move on to the second bone colour. For that, what we're going to do is we're going to start out by reapplying our Rakarth flesh. We're going to thin that down to a little bit more than just 2 thin coats, get it to about 3 thin coats again. And then just slowly building up by doing lines, quick little lines going down from the shaded part down to the edge of the hoof like that. And just keep going backwards and forwards, back and building it up as you go. And when you've built that out the first coat, give it a second coat and go backwards and forwards, and it will start to build up that sort of texture look without actually having texture on the miniature. And once we've finished with the reapplication of the Rakarth flesh, we are going to move on to Pallid Witch flesh for the final highlight on these. And what we're going to do is we are going to just work out on slightly less of it again, and almost on the very edges is those dark little streaks that are on there, and just go across, building them up slightly, and then if you have to, go back a second time and do a little more accurate highlight over certain bits. And that is the bone finished. And that's all the bone finished up. Looking very nice, if you ask me. Now we are going to move on to the purples, and we are going to start with this funny seed poddy thing at the end of the barbed strangler. For that, we are going to be using Gene Stealer Purple to go over this. So we're going to start painting it over the purple, leaving the darker part in the recesses. I'm just going to take a couple of coats to get this done. And once that's done, we are going to highlight it with Decala Lilac. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to aim to do a nice thin line going around where you got the darker purple in the very deep recesses of it. and just do a little line of it like that. And go around doing all of that, and then that's this purple done. And next we are going to move on to the darker purple ones on his little shoulder pads here. What we're going to start off doing is we're going to take some Naggaroth Night and thin it down to a glaze consistency. And we're going to work it from not quite halfway up to the edges, like that. Try and reinforce that dark purple. And you want to do this over a couple of coats, so use a hairdryer in between, speed up the drying process. And once we've done that, we are going to move on to a relatively thick edge highlight of Xerius Purple. It might look a bit bright and strong when you first put it down, but as it dries, it will lose some of that vibrancy. And it'll help add a little bit of brightness to the edges of it. Just go around the entire edge of both of them, including the back of it, building it up. Next up, we're going to do an edge highlight of Genestealer Purple, which we're going to work around all the edges and try and get this highlight as thin as you can. So turn the model round so you can get to the edge of it and just run your brush across the edge like that. And go around, build that up. And then to finish off, we're going to take a small highlight of Dakala Lilac again and just put that on the very tips of the sharp pointy bits going around it, just to add that little bit of final brightness. And then when we've got that done, we can move on to the final purple, which is the main part of his body. For this final purple, what we are going to do is we are going to start out with a coat of Xerius Purple, which we're just going to reapply over most of it, but leave any darker patches of wash visible through there. Don't paint over the entire lot. And just keep building it up and layering it on there until you've got a nice brighter shade of purple over the darker stuff. And then we are going to go in with a bit of an edge highlight of Genestealer Purple and just work that around some of the edges of the armour panels and pick out some of the edges of the darker recessed parts to help emphasise that detail a little bit, and that will again start giving it that little hint of texture. And then to finish it off, what we're going to do is give it another little point highlight of Dakala Lilac and just pick out some of the edges, or the very tips of the edges this time basically, and just add that sort of hint of a shine to it. And once we have gone round all of that and put in the little bits of brighter purple just as very point highlights, we are finished with the purples and we're ready to move on to next. But next we're going to move on to this very top armour in the dark blue. And what we're going to do is we are going to give it an edge highlight initially of Fenrisian Grey. We're going to work around all of the edges as well as any of the little split details that are on there. And what we're also going to do is thin it down a fair bit and do some very quick little lines just about here to go into onto the tips of it. Just build them up like quick little lines building up with its thin paint. And after we've got all the Fenrisian Grey laid down, next we are going to go in with a bit more of a targeted highlight of Blue Horror. I'm going to just do that around the very tips of the spines here and any other sharper corners. And don't worry that this does look very bright so far, because we're going to be adding a bit of a contrast paint glaze over this to bring the brightness back down. And for that, what we're going to be using is Contrast Medium and Contrast Paint Space Wolf's Grey. I'm going to mix it in about 4 parts medium to 1 part Space Wolf Grey, so quite a thin mix. And not use this like a wash, we're going to use it like a tint to go over the whole surface, just to tone down the brightness of the highlights we've just added and add a little bit more of a bluer tint to it as we're going. Also, not forgetting to do the hilts of the bone swords, same. So do the highlighting stage that we've done beforehand, as well as apply the Space Wolf Grey glaze over there. And then to finish off all the final stages, is what we're going to do is the veins on the bone swords coming off the black hilts. And for that we're going to use some very, very thin down Abaddon Black and get the thinnest, pointiest brush you can And start from the very ends of the veins like that and just work them through in some squiggly little lines. Build them up. If you look at the Codex art, you can get a bit of an idea of the sort of shape you're going to be aiming for. And with that, that's all the darker ones, and we've only got a few stages left to go from here. So let's get to it. Moving on quickly now, we are going to next do the green areas for highlighting. We're going to start with the trunking on in between the hands and the joints and the cabling on the gun, which is where I'm going to show you this on. I start with a highlight of Sotec green, just trying to be as neat as I can, but you don't have to be massively neat, and putting it on all the raised areas over the cabling and on anything else. And the next one I use is Temple Guard blue. Now, as much as this does have blue in the name, and it does look very blue when it's coming down, I can assure you this does actually read as green by the time it's finished, which I was quite surprised at. So don't worry, persevere, we'll get there. And then the final highlight we're going to do over this particular green is we're going to go back and do some more Gauss Blaster green. And this is just going to be a tiny little speck highlight again, just on the top uppermost areas of each bit. So just like that on the tubes going on the gun, and on any little bits of hands and in between the joints of his arms. Just little dots just to make sure that brightness is brought through. And the next what we're going to do is we're going to do the green on the little under seed poddy creature on the gun. And for that we're going to start with a highlight of Cabalite green and start applying it onto the veins, and just pick out the little top bits of them, just kind of stipple this on. You don't have to be amazingly controlled with your brush, just kind of stipple it on there as you go, as well as working it in between the pink scales on that underorganism. And then next up we're going to do a coat of Sybarite green, and just try and pick out some of the more raised areas on this one and be very careful with it. So use the pointiest brush you've got and just work it around nicely onto some of the little top uppermost areas and bring out some of the texture on it, and the same for in between those little pinky scales. And then to finish it off, we're going to give it also a little highlight of Gauss Blaster green, and just again very limited little areas, just tiny little dots of this are going over it just to add that little shine to it. With these we are really starting to whiz on. We've only really got a couple of areas left to do and we're finished. Because the weapon's still in my hand, I'm going to do the highlights on the Barbed Strangler now. To begin with, I'm going to apply some Emperor's Children to these sort of crustacean-y parts on this under creature on the weapon. What I'm going to do is sort of stipple this on to start giving it the impression of texture again, and just work around these doing that. And I'm also going to do the Emperor's Children on this end part of the Barbed Strangler. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to layer this on, leaving the darkest pink still there in the shaded recesses of this. Really try and bring out the texture. Basically this whole part is all about bringing the texture on this sculpt. And we can do that in various different ways by either stippling or doing little quick lines to apply the highlight to it. Next is going to be Fulgrim Pink, which I'm going to do as an edge highlight going all around these little shell parts. And there's no quick way of doing it other than just taking your time and going nice and slow. And if you do make a mistake, just grab some Emperor's Children and tidy it up. I'm also going to use the Fulgrim Pink on this part of the Barbed Strangler. What we're going to do is just very carefully and slowly highlight up with it over all the areas that we can see, leaving the darker areas in the recesses still there, and just steadily build this up. And we're also going to use the Fulgrim Pink on the end of the barrel to start bringing out the highlights on it in little quick, swift ticking motions like that, and start working around the edges of some of the detail that we've picked out with the Emperor's Children already. And then for our final highlight on these, what we're going to do is we are going to do a 50-50 mix of White Scar and Fulgrim Pink, so it's almost white but not quite. We're going to add some tiny little dot speck highlights and little lines around the very edge of the barrel like that, and some other little recessed details, just very few select little spots just to bring out the detail, that final little touch. And we're also going to use this mix on the very end of the barrel, just there, just doing some little tiny ticking lines again just to help bring that out. As you can see there, I've also used some Abaddon black to paint the barrel in. To finish off, what we're going to do is use a highlight of Calgar blue on the blue of this hose part here and around the blue part on the barrel. We're just going to do some very careful thin little lines around the edges of the detail and along the barrel underneath there. And then finally for the blue, we're going to use some blue horror and just some very select little spots again, just a tiny little bit of it. And with that, we're almost finished. And then on the green parts, I'm going to use some Sybarite green, which I'm going to apply on just some tiny little edge areas like that on the edges, just flicking it on. And then finish that off with some Gauss Blaster green, just to get on some tiny little select spots to give that extra hint of shine. And with that, that is the weapon finished. And we can move on to the red carapace. For the red carapace, what I'm going to do is start off by layering back up with Evil Sun Scarlet. And I'm just going to make sure I'm leaving in any of the darker bits that are left by the Blood Angels red contrast paint. And you can see as you turn it round, I'm starting with the legate, and just go around taking your time, leaving the darker bits in there as you go. And that'll really help to bring out the detail in this sculpt and really start adding that good old texture that we're after. Now, for my highlight on this, if you look at the actual pictures in the Codex, you'll see that the highlights aren't really done in an orange or anything like that. They've got a more pinky quality to them. So what I've decided to do is do a mix of 1 part Evil Sun Scarlet to 2 parts Kislev Flesh. And this will make a much pinker highlight without it going into the really pink spectrum. And what I'm doing is I'm just picking out some of the more pronounced edges of the detail that's been sculpted into it. So along areas like the calf muscles, around the edges of his hooves, and around the edges of any spiky bits that are on there. And for the tongue, what I've done is I've put a bit of Evil Sun Scarlet towards the tip of it to leave the darker black gradient that we built up visible there still. And now I'm going to use that mix for highlight. I'm just going to apply a little bit just down the very sides of it like that, and then use it in the wrinkly parts on the top to add in that little extra hint of shine. And with that highlight done on the red, it really has helped to bring out the sculpted texture in this chitin on here, and it really does, well, at least for me, bring back such fond memories of these older sculpts. Especially when you look at the tail, the combination of the Blood Angels red contrast paint and highlighting up the way we have has really helped give it that 2nd edition vibrancy and look. From here, we are going to start highlighting the head and the hands and everything, but first we are going to highlight the veins coming onto his head. We are going to start that with Pink Horror, and we're just going to pick out the detail that we can see on there. And just pick them out with little lines going through, and as you get to the end, just do little ticking motions on it. And go backwards and forwards and build them up a little bit on there to start picking out the edges of the wrinkles in the veins. After that, we're going to be using some Emperor's Children. And we're going to try and be a little bit more precise with this and just put it up towards the top part of these things. Just little dots of it, being a little bit more precise as you go. And then to finish off, we are going to give a final little pinpoint highlight using Full Grim Pink. And we're just going to do this to add that final little hint of brightness and shine to them. And just pick out the very tops of each little bit that you've done. And then once we've done that, we are ready to move on to the final stages of this paint job, which is going to be doing the purple skin on his face and hands. And finally we are highlighting the purple flesh. I'm going to start by reapplying a layer of Warp Fiend Grey over this. And we're going to pretty much apply this over the entire area of the flesh, except for the very deepest recesses, and use this to start building up the very basic layers of our highlights as we go. And we're going to do this entire process, so like all of these little highlighting stages, we're going to do with many little lines, building it up as we go. And this will help to build up the effect as it goes. Once we've done that layer, we are going to move on to a highlight of Slanesh Grey. And again, this is pretty much going to go over nearly the entirety of the previous layer, leaving some very few parts of it still visible. And we're going to use this layer here to start building up the impression of all the detail and everything on there, and start using it to accentuate little bits. And this is the part as well where we start to really bring out the detail of the face. So start picking out around areas like the eyebrows, around the nose, the forehead, and all up around the gums. And all that you can start really refining your facial features here. And then once we've done the first coat of Slanesh Grey, we're going to come in with a second coat of this, because you won't have reached full opacity with the first coat at all. And this one, if you just cover slightly less area, and as you see, using those little tiny hatching lines with your paintbrush to build up the look of this. And you keep working backwards and forwards on your second coat until we've finished that off. And finally, for the actual flesh, we are going to be moving on to a thinned down coat of Ulthuan Grey. And this we are going to, if you look at the Codex artwork, you'll be able to see the sort of detail there, and just do your best to try and copy that if you want. And you can work this round, because it's quite thin, you can do this over several coats, be about 2-3 coats sort of thing. And as you do it, you can just refine it as you go. And where it is thin, even though it looks quite bright for the initial stages, it will dull down as it dries, and so it will build up over numerous coats. And with that final coat of highlighting Ulthuan Grey on here, we've really brought out the features of this guy's head. And he's looking very scary if you ask me. Now, to finish off, we're going to do the eyes. And what I'm going to do is pick them out in pure white, and then I start by putting in a bit of Uriel yellow, and just neatly put it in and fill in that eye socket. And then once you've done the Uriel yellow, we're going to finish that off with a highlight of Flash Gits yellow to really make those eyes pop that last little bit. And then finally, I'm going to get some contrast paint Flesh Tearers red. And if you want to get the thinnest, pointiest paintbrush you've got, and we're going to use these to draw in these little tiny veins that appear on the end of the tube things on his head. And just with the very tip of your little brush, draw them in there as thinly and as carefully as you can, just little squiggly lines. And again, contrast paints are absolutely perfect for this, where they're so thin but lay down so well. And with those veins done, that is the head and everything fully highlighted and finished off. And he is looking proper scary. And now we are ready to move on and glue the arm on for the final things. A little tip I thought I'd give for when you're pinning things into place. Drill the hole slightly bigger than what you're using to actually pin it in. So if you're using a usual little thin paper clip, they're usually about 0.7 millimeters thick. So if you drill a millimeter diameter hole into where you want to pin, you'll have a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to gluing whatever parts on there, which can be extremely handy for locating the pins and the parts when it comes to gluing it on. And so all we have to do then is get the arm glued on, do the base, and we shall be back with the final shots. And with the weapon glued on and the base finished, this Hive Tyrant is now ready to lead the swarm in gathering biomass for the hive mind. The initial weapon swap conversion of taking out the lash whip and replacing it with a bone sword wasn't nearly as tricky as I feared it would be, and again, if anybody is thinking of giving this sort of thing a go, I highly recommend they do. And I must also recommend contrast paints for doing things like wet blending and adding depth to your colour schemes. They are absolutely ideally suited for this purpose. And with that, this video draws to a close. If you made it this far, thank you very much, and if you've enjoyed it, consider giving us a like, and if you aren't already, maybe even subscribe and hit the bell icon. Remember, in the description below there will be a link to my commission painting website, and to sign off, stay smiling and keep the Oldhammer alive.